Events and delegates in Unity help your game's code to stay organized and flexible. They make it easy for different parts of your game to communicate together without getting tangled up, which keeps things simple and makes your code easier to work with. In my project, I have just 2 empty scripts, and in my scene, I have 2 empty game objects on which I have those scripts. So I have one script sender and game object sender and script receiver. You can obviously make it work just with one script. We'll start with delegates. So what is it? It is just a variable that is holding a reference to some method or function. Just really simple. So to a delegate, we can assign some function or multiple functions and then just call them using the delegate. So how do we create delegate? We just type public or private. So I'll make it private for now. Then we type delegate. And then, because this will be storing a function, we need to type the return type of the function. So it can either be a void with no return type, or for example a bool, integer, and so on. So I will start just with a void, then give it some name, and then to the parentheses we can give it some parameters if we want. So I will just leave it empty for now. Now this on its own is not going to do anything. This is just the definition of the delegate. So the delegate is called myDelegate, which is a new type that we can now use, and the return type is void, so no return type, and it has no parameters. As we have defined our delegate type, we can actually create a variable from it. So again, private, and now we can use the type, so myDelegate, and we can call it myDelegate again. So first, we are creating the data type myDelegate, so we know that it is a void and it has no parameters, and then we are creating a variable based off it. So now we'll need to create one or multiple functions as we want that have the same return type and the same parameters. So we have those 2 functions that have the same return type and the same parameters, and now we can do multiple things with the delegate. We can obviously call it, which will call all of the functions that are being subscribed to the delegate, or we can just add some functions to it. So we can say my delegate is equal to, let's say, my void1, which will just assign the function to the delegate. So the delegate is now referencing to my void1. So if I would invoke the delegate, so my delegate, parentheses for the parameters, and semicolon, it would just call this function. So we are storing this function in this variable and then just call it. This on its own is nothing too special, but what we can do is assign multiple functions to one delegate. So we can just type plus equals my void1 and my delegate plus equals my void2. And notice that when I'm just assigning the function to the delegate, I'm not putting the parentheses because we are not actually calling it with any data. We are just assigning it to the delegate. So using one delegate, we are calling 2 functions. Now we were just subscribing to these functions, but we can also unsubscribe the same way. So my delegate minus equals, let's say, my void1. And now it is only calling my void2. But what is going to happen if we assign no functions to the delegate? Well, it is going to give us an error. So always it is important to do also a null check. So we have a classic null check just like that. If the delegate is not equal to null, we can just call it, or there is a short version of it. So just like that, we are checking if it is not equal to null. If this is true, we are just invoking it, which is the same way as just calling it. And now we are getting no errors because the delegate is not being called. Now let's add some input parameters and different return type for the function. And as we have changed that, we obviously also need to change the functions that should be subscribing to the delegate, and we also need to call it with some value. So now the return type of the delegate is a integer, and it is also taking in parameter as a integer. So I have made a function for it. Again, the return type is integer, and it is taking in integer. Names of the parameters don't have to match up, so you can see that here I have value and here I have just val, and I'm just returning some value. So we can use it, for example, in debug.log, and when calling the delegate, we can just input the parameter. Yep, and the output is correct. Sometimes what you may also see other people do is just add a event keyword before defining the variable for the delegate. So we could just add it here, event, and this doesn't really add some functionality, it is just removing some functionality from the delegate. But for this, we'll need to also set up the receiver. So I will make the delegate public and make the event public too, so we can access it in the receiver script. So in the receiver class, I also have a reference for the sender. So now we can access the delegate sender.myDelegate. And normally what we could do is just to set it to some function, just like that. So my void, but you can see that right now it is giving us error, which is because we have marked the delegate as event. So if I remove this, you can see that we will be able to just set it. So this is pretty much all that the event keyword does. But when we leave the event keyword there, we can still do plus equals. So we leave event there, and I can still just add to it or subtract it. Another thing that we can't do with the delegate is to call it. We can't just input some value and call it like that. But in the class where we have defined the delegate, we can still set it, and we can obviously also call it. So the event keyword is really simple but pretty useful because it can protect your delegates. You may not always want to be creating these functions just like that if they are really simple, so what we can do is to assign an anonymous method. So how do we do that? We can say myDelegate is equal, then we need to input the parameters of the method. So in this case we need an integer, then we need to use Lambda expression, which is the new thing, so just equals arrow, and then we will have body of the function, so just square brackets, semicolon after that because we are setting the delegate, and in these square brackets we can just type anything we want to happen in the function body. So because the return type of the delegate is integer, we need to return something, so we can return, let's say, value plus 5. So assigning anonymous function to a delegate can be more convenient because we don't have to be defining it outside of the start void, so you can just assign the anonymous function like that, and we can also put a lot more stuff into it. But one thing that you can't do with it is you can't subtract the listener. So from the myDelegate, I now obviously can't subtract this function because it is an anonymous function. And we can see that the anonymous function still works the same. What you may also see some other people to use is a func, but it is pretty much the same as a delegate. To add it, we need to add using system, and then we can use the func keyword, so private func, and you can notice that it is a generic type. So we need to specify the input and output parameters, but we don't really need the inputs, we just need the output. So we can say the output is an integer, and then just give it some name. So now we could create one or multiple functions that are matching the signature of the func and just assign it. When creating the func, the last generic parameter is always the result. So if I would put many of them, int, boolean and integer, the first two ones are just inputs and the last one is output. So now the input of my function is integer and the output is boolean. So I have created a function to match the signature. So output type of boolean, input of integer, and I'm just adding the function to the func and then just calling it in debug.log. So we can see that it works fine. Another useful thing to know related to events is the Unity event, which you can use directly in the inspector, so it is really accessible to the designers and your whole development team. To use Unity events, we need to add using Unity engine.events, and now we can use the Unity event keyword, so I will make it public to be able to see it in the inspector. To add or remove listeners from the Unity event, it is a bit different. So we can use the variable Unity event dot, and we can use either add listener or we can remove them. So remove listener, and if you want to call the event, we can just use that invoke. So this works the same way as with the delegates. And the best thing about Unity event is that now we can go to the Unity itself, and we can see that on the sender script we have the event, and we can specify all of the things that we want to happen right in the inspector. So I can hit the plus, and let's say that I want this square to disappear. I can just drag the object, select the function, so GameObject, set active to false, and it is going to work that simple. By the way, if you have ever used buttons, you have already probably used the events because you can see them under the button component on the button. All of that seems really nice, and it looks that it could make your code a lot cleaner, but you may not really be sure where you can use it in your actual projects. So first thing that I have thought of is some game event manager, so you could create a delegate for that, which would be just a void, and then you could create many variables. So you could have game event manager on level completed, on game over, on random event, and you could assign any functions you would want. So let's say on game over, you want the player to die, you want all of the enemies to die, you want maybe to show some score screen, you want to do all kinds of other stuff. So this is really a great way to use events when you want to happen multiple things at the same time. So you can just store it in a single delegate and then call it, subscribe many listeners to the delegate, so all of the functions are listening to it even without you needing to actually call them. Or let's say that your player can use multiple spells, but at one time he can just have one spell. So you would be checking if he has fire spell or if he has ice spell. And this way you would need all kinds of different functions for different spells, and in the attack function you would be always checking if it is the fire spell, if it is the ice spell, and in each of these cases we would need to call a different function. But what would be way better would be just to assign one of these functions to the attack delegate, so that we can always just call the delegate and it will call the function based on the type of spell that the player has. So you would have some void, let's say on spell changed, which would just quickly go through all of these functions and just assign the correct one based on the spell that the player has collected, and then when he wants to attack, we don't need to be deciding which of the functions it should play. It will just call the delegate and this will already be holding the correct function. Or let's say that when you play the game, you first need to load some assets, but you don't want to be waiting for a lot of time. So what you can do instead is create some async operation that will be loading the assets asynchronously. So you can just wait for some amount of time. But later you may need to, let's say, spawn some enemies after you have loaded the enemy prefab or some other stuff. So what you can do here is just create a delegate when the loading is complete, and when we just call the delegate, which is happening inside the IEnumerator. So once we have waited for the time to complete the async operation, we can just call the onloading complete delegate, and this will then call all of the other functions that we need, such as spawning the enemies, loading some other stuff, and so on. I hope that now you see some of the potential uses for events and delegates in your own projects. I hope this video was useful. If you have any questions or suggestions, drop them down to the comments. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and I will see you in next videos. Bye! Thanks for watching this video till the end. If you are looking for a Unity, C# or Bolt tutor, then I am here for you, so feel free to send me a message to my Gmail and take a look at my website for more info. I can help you with your personal projects or teach you anything about game development you would want to know. You are welcome.